Hello and welcome to our webinar on cyber and main threats to charities. We decided to start this webinar series, which is the first webinar, because we're a charity and we're very focused on helping other charities to increase their impact through their use of digital technology. We decided therefore that a webinar series was a great way to cover a wide range of topics for charities, and that we would provide those on a free of charge basis. The types of topics we're doing, as well as cybersecurity, include communications and social media, leadership, fundraising, collaboration, and many others. We're going to be running the sessions at lunchtime, typically on a Thursday, because we think that makes them as accessible as possible. And the next session we're going to be running is on creating your social media content calendar, which we'll be delivering in collaboration with Lightful, and that's next Thursday. Then we've got on Friday the 1st of March, a session with Zoe Amar, who's the chair of the Charity Digital Code of Practice, which will be looking into the whole area of digital leadership, and we'll have more details published on that in due course. Other things we do at Tech Trust include Charities Digital News, which I imagine many of you already know about, and you probably signed up through that. We also run a number of events, and we've got our first multi-stream Charities Digital Conference coming up on the 13th of February. We've been very lucky to secure some grants and bursaries for this, which are actually going to help subsidise both access to the conference and access for it for charities. So there's still a few tickets left if people are interested in that. Other things we do, we run our TT Mail program, which is a white label mail service where we use .mailer technology at a very compelling price. We have TT Exchange, which provides access to discounted and donated technology, and our Charity Digital job site as well. But now let's move to the main topic of today, which is cyber threats, session is going to be presented by Cub from the National Security Centre, National Cybersecurity Centre. It's the first in a series of cybersecurity sessions that we'll be running throughout the year. And we're doing that because it's really too broad a topic to cover in one session. We're not expecting people to necessarily join for every session. It's totally down to each of you to dip in and out of topics as you think they apply to you, and that actually applies to the whole of the program as well. So, without any further ado, I'd like to now pass to Cub.
Thanks, Jonathan. So, the National Cybersecurity Centre is the government agency responsible for cybersecurity in the UK. We're a part of the intelligence agency GCHQ, and we're the public-facing part of that organisation. Our mission is to make the UK the safest place to live and work online. And by the UK, we really do mean all parts of the UK economy and society. And therefore, we've been working with charities for about the last 18 months to understand the types of attacks that they are vulnerable to, ones that they're perhaps falling victim to already, and give them some really simple steps about what they can do to protect themselves better online. So the first thing I'm going to cover today is a pretty easy question, but one that often confuses a lot of people about what is cybersecurity. And there's the technical definition up on your screens there now. Cybersecurity is the means by which individuals and organisations reduce their risk of becoming victims of a cyber attack. So essentially its core function is to protect the devices that most of us will use, so smartphones, laptops, tablets and computers, the services we access both online and at work, from theft or damage. It's also about preventing unauthorised access to the vast amounts of personal information we now store on these devices and online as well. And it's important because smartphones, computers and the internet are now such a fundamental part of modern life. It's difficult to imagine how we'd kind of function without them nowadays, whether that's from online banking and shopping to email and social media. It's more important than ever that we take the steps that can prevent cyber criminals getting hold of our accounts, our data and our devices. And it's also quite important at this stage to emphasize that cybersecurity has other benefits as well. So it doesn't just help you protect the information that could be, stolen by cyber attackers or criminals, but it also helps kind of protect information that could be destroyed through floods, a fire, or a robbery, traditional physical robbery of your home or office. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we discuss backing up data later on.
And the information I'm kind of about to go through came out of a threat assessment that we published sort of the middle part of last year. And it was the first threat assessment that's ever been done on the charity sector in relation to Cyber UK. And it went through a number of things, from why charities are at risk to who they're at risk from, and what the types of attacks they're falling victim to are. So taking you through that, charities hold funds, as you know, or we all need funds to function. They hold personal, financial and commercial data. And funds and data have a financial value to a cyber criminal, whether they use those to try and attack another person with that data or sell it on to other criminal entities. And in holding those funds and data, often we've seen, with quite low levels of security protecting it, charities become quite an easy target for cyber criminals and attackers. Charities are also, where charities are commissioned to deliver local authority contracts or perhaps private sector contracts, they're potentially a route into the sort of bigger fish, as it were. And they're now fulfilling roles that were traditionally done by government and therefore had their cybersecurity provided by government. But it's likely that with charities doing those roles, they could potentially be sort of a cog in a cyber criminal's plan to get to that bigger fish, whether they're using them as a sort of imitating that smaller organisation to trick the local authority into doing something, or in some cases we've seen it the other way, where the local authority or government has a cybersecurity incident, and unfortunately the smaller organisation that was part of their supply chain becomes collateral damage along the way. We've also found in this research that there's quite low levels of awareness of the cybersecurity threat and what to do about it, particularly amongst smaller charities who just don't have the funds or the resource to really dedicate too much time to doing anything about cybersecurity. And quite often that's also because charities and the smaller ones in particular don't perceive themselves as a target or holding anything of value to a charity, to an attacker. And because of that, we've kind of judged that charities are falling victims to a wide range of attacks. The one unique thing that we found with charities was that there's a culture of trust amongst charities and in the sector more widely that doesn't exist so much in the private sector or in government. And that's because to be able to do their jobs, charities need to be trusting of the public, their beneficiaries, and the staff that are working for the organisation. An example we got given was, it's not that uncommon for someone to email or call a charity and offer to hand over money without any strings attached. That just wouldn't happen in the private sector because everything there is a commodity. But in a charity, it absolutely would. And through doing that kind of ruse such as that, it can, criminals will use that to exploit that trust amongst charities. So who are charities at risk from? There's a list, as you'll see on your screens now. There's a bit of a myth when it comes to cyber criminals, and this is predominantly down to Hollywood. We have a perception of what a cyber criminal is, and it broadly follows this format. So a cyber attacker is a he, it's always a he. He's very young, late teens or early 20s. He hacked into his first nuclear missile facility at the age of just 5. At the age of 12, he started on bank heists. He bought his first hoodie with the proceeds, and his face has not been seen since. He works alternately for the Russian, Chinese, Iranian and North Korean governments and spends his time in his bedroom in darkness with green letters and numbers for wallpaper. He's very clever with computers. In fact, he's so clever, he can't be defeated. Thankfully, for the sake of the world, this is a myth perpetuated in films, but certainly so far as the type of person you're going to be protecting your charity from, it's not that description. the people you really are going to be protecting your charity from are cyber criminals who are almost always motivated by money, which means for them, if the cost of both in time and in resources of going after your organisation is going to cost them more in time and effort than the money or the value of the data that they're going to get, they're unlikely to bother. There's an analogy here with your traditional burglar. If you have a 5-metre mortise lock on your door, all the windows are locked, you have an obvious alarm and perhaps a dog, it's pretty unlikely your average burglar is going to bother. It's just not worth the risk. If you take a similar approach to cybersecurity, a large proportion of cyber attackers just won't bother. You've also got the indirect attacks. And we alluded to these earlier where we talked about how perhaps charities are a route to a bigger fish. So threats may not come from direct attacks on charities, but it's common for charities either to be outsourcing a large proportion of their IT or data to third parties, and criminals or other groups may be able to gain access to the charities' networks or information through these companies. And in those areas of the economy where they're stepping in to deliver commission services, there's often a need to share systems and data with those larger organisations. And it's possible that in doing so, criminals may use the charities as an easy route to get to that bigger fish. We're working on some guidance at the moment for suppliers to make sure that they're being diligent in how they look after the security between the big companies and their supply chain. We'll be publishing that hopefully later this year. There's also the threat from insiders, both the intentional insider and the inadvertent one. We'll focus on the intentional ones first. So we have to trust our staff, our trustees and volunteers to use the charity's IT systems and software both safely and legitimately. However, this trust does have risks attached to it. Disgruntled employees or volunteers could pass on their credentials to attackers or introduce malicious software onto the system, or quite simply just steal data and sell it themselves. More commonly though, an insider attack isn't intentional. It's the inadvertent insider. And many users may download a seemingly legitimate piece of software as part of their day-to-day work, which contains a virus or malicious software that they are now introducing onto the charity's networks. They may also be using a weak password, which is easily guessed by an attacker, giving them access to the organisation's systems. And inadvertent insiders shouldn't necessarily be blamed for, letting the attackers in, but instead it's quite important to help your staff become more security conscious and help make sure they don't become the weaker link in that chain. There's a few others that we have seen but are less likely for most charities. These are the hacktivists, people who are motivated by a specific cause, perhaps to advance a political or personal agenda. A reasonably famous one of this was back in 2012, where someone gained access to the website of UK Pregnancy Advice Organisation, defaced it and stole the information of around 10,000 service users. We've also seen incidences of terrorist organisations have been known to deface the websites of charities who are working against their aims as a terrorist group. And we've seen some nation-state attacks, so by countries who aren't friendly to the UK. These are very rare, but the most famous one of late was the WannaCry attack in May 2017. It was reported predominantly in the media as being an attack on the NHS. It in fact wasn't intended to affect the NHS so heavily, but a vulnerability that they were exploiting was very prevalent across the NHS, and therefore it affected them quite a lot. That attack has been widely attributed to North Korea, and it just shows how those kind of nation-state attacks can have a really adverse effect on organisations that perhaps weren't the intended, and charities have counted amongst that. So how are charities being attacked? And by this we mean the types of attacks that they're falling victim to, or that criminals are trying to make them fall victim to. There's a few on your screen now which I'll talk through. So the first of which is ransomware and extortion. Ransomware simply means ransom software. It's where a cyber attacker gains access to an organization's systems or a website and locks it down so that you can't access it. You normally then get an email or a message in some way that offers to unlock it in exchange for a payment of their ransom. That payment normally comes in the form of bitcoins or some sort of cryptocurrency like that. And putting aside for the fact that you'll spend probably half a day trying to work out how to buy bitcoins, we'd always recommend never paying that ransom, because there's no guarantee that you're going to be able to get your data back. In those cases, charities may be targeted directly. They might be inadvertently affected by an attack aimed elsewhere, or by some sort of mass indiscriminate campaign seeking to exploit as many victims as possible. The WannaCry attack was an example of that as well. And they may not just steal or deny access to data, they may delete or change it through that kind of ransomware attack. You then have, quite similarly to ransomware, extortion attacks, where a cyber attacker will steal data or commercially sensitive information, and they'll threaten to release it publicly or sell it on if you don't pay them a fee. This is obviously quite concerning for charities where they're involved in the protection of vulnerable individuals, perhaps those looking after children, or perhaps domestic abuse charities, and those holding sensitive medical information, who could be quite susceptible to this form of extortion because that data is so vital to their functioning as an organisation. You then have malware and spyware. So malware simply means malicious software. And attackers will often try and get malware and spyware onto an organisation's systems to steal data or look for other more valuable leads to use in the future. There's many ways, unfortunately, to get malware onto a system, but the most common ones are normally clicking on links in an email or by visiting unsecure websites. And when we go through to talk about some guidance shortly, there's some bits that focus on those, how to protect yourself against those kind of attacks. You then have what we call business email attacks. You might have heard these called phishing attacks, phishing spelled with a PH, not like the fishing for fish. There are many ways that criminals can use email to launch cyber attacks. Normally, the phishing attack isn't actually the intended attack. It normally facilitates them doing something else, whether that be downloading ransomware or malicious software onto your system, or trying to get you to enter some details. So they'll try and trick staff or perhaps trustees or volunteers into clicking a link that seems quite genuine, but in reality does contain something malicious, or perhaps sends you to a fake website that looks remarkably, in some cases, like the one that you thought it would be sending you to. We've also seen, unfortunately, them tricking employees with financial authority for the organisation into transferring money to their bank accounts instead of the ones that were intended, perhaps by impersonating a supplier, or by pretending to be someone senior in the organisation who needs an invoice paid for them urgently, when in fact it's just the criminals purporting to be that person. Quite recently, a UK charity lost £13,000 after the email of its CEO was hacked and a fraudulent message sent to the charity's financial manager with instructions to release those funds. The other purpose often of a phishing attack, a business email attack, is to gain access to a staff or volunteer's work email address. They can then use this access to send emails pretending to be from the organisation, and build up trust with other third parties, which just extends their network as a criminal. This can be hugely damaging to your charity's reputation if it led to losses by that third party or perhaps a supplier of yours. And then finally, for ones we've seen across the charity sector, there's fake organisations and websites. And we've seen, unfortunately, criminals are exploiting the credibility and appeal of charities to trick donors into giving money to what appears to be a legitimate charity. And this is often achieved through the creation of fake organisations and accompanying websites. And unfortunately, criminals react quite quickly to exploit disasters and global events to steal donations. There was a lot of media reporting around the events of 2017 with the terrorist attacks and sort of fires and things like that, where criminals would immediately pop up with websites that looked like they were legitimate charities, only to then find that actually people were donating to criminals instead. And this can have quite a lot of financial and reputational ramifications for the genuine charities that they're impersonating. So up next is the guidance that we released last year. It's called the Cybersecurity Small Charity Guide, and we're going to be going through a lot of the content in more detail in the next webinar, but I just wanted to highlight this today because all of the threats that we've spoken about so far can be mitigated very well with the guidance that's in this piece of work, and it's broken down into 5 areas. So the first of which is backing up your data. This isn't actually a defense in itself, but it allows you to recover if you suffer a cyber attack. So it's really important to make sure that all of the data that you need to function as an organization is available to you if something happens. And when I said earlier that cybersecurity is also a useful way to protect yourself from things like fire, floods, burglaries, that kind of thing, having a backup of your data, whether that's on the cloud or an offline backup, perhaps to a USB stick or an external hard drive, means that should all of your devices be destroyed or stolen, you have a way of recovering as an organization. The guidance provides some steps on how to protect your charity from malware. So that can take the form of some simple steps like antivirus, but also some really easy ones, like making sure when your laptop or mobile device pops up with a thing to say, there's an update available, would you like to install it now? We all know those can be quite annoying and they always tend to pop up at a really inopportune time. But they're actually really important because they contain really critical security updates for your device. So when the likes of Windows or Apple, for the majority of computers and laptops, discover that there's a potential vulnerability in their operating system or in your device, they will work out how to fix it and they'll issue that fix in the next set of updates. So it's really important that you install those as soon as they're in. As an example of what happens when a lot of people don't, the WannaCry attack that I've mentioned before, the fix for that attack was issued 56 days before the attack really took hold. And as a result, had everybody done their updates and installed it, we wouldn't have suffered quite the large-scale attack that we did. There's also some guidance on smartphones and tablets, which, as we know, are a little bit different to laptops and computers. It's quite similar to how you protect your charity from malware. So again, on your smartphones and tablets, it's really important to do your updates. Make sure that if they're going to leave the office, they're password protected at all times. So whether that's just the 4-digit PIN that perhaps you have on your phone, or if you have a longer password on your tablets or perhaps mobile phone as well, that's ideal. And it also provides some really simple guidance on how to remotely erase your device if it were to get stolen. Also quite a useful tip for when you lose your house and when you lose your phone in the house and you just want to check that it hasn't fallen out of your bag on the way home or something, because actually those kind of useful tools not only help your security but also just make it a bit easier for you as a user as well. Passwords. I would love to live in a world where we didn't need passwords, and we're slowly moving towards that as more phones have perhaps fingerprint access or Face ID in some cases. But passwords are still the best way to protect your data. And we're moving away from trying to tell people to have really long, complex passwords made up of letters and numbers and symbols and uppercase and lowercase, and instead encourage people to use things that are going to be a bit easier to remember. And we're encouraging people to use 3 random words. So when you set your next password, think of 3 completely random words and join them together. And the reason for that is where people try and invent really complicated passwords, what it turns out is actually they're inventing what is a complicated password to type, but actually a password that a lot of other people have as well. So we constantly see the top 25 passwords in the world that get exposed in data breaches being pretty much the same time and time again. So we're trying to encourage people to use 3 random words, because it's not going to be as easy for an attacker to guess, and it's going to move people away from using things like sequential numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or password 1, 2, 3, that kind of thing. If anybody's using either of those 2 passwords, I definitely encourage you to change it today. And also encourage people to install or activate 2-factor authentication on their really important accounts. So most people will be familiar with that from their banking, where you have to enter your password, and then normally you have to perhaps put your card into a PIN reader, or authorize a text that comes through on your phone perhaps. And the reason that's really important is because for someone else to gain access to your accounts, you need to have not only the password that you know, but you need to have something that you have, whether that's the phone or the card or the PIN reader. And that just means that your average attacker really isn't going to be able to get past those defenses. And then avoiding phishing attacks. And we've intentionally not called it stop phishing attacks, because it is really easy for anyone to send an email to your organization or to your staff, and have them click on a link or something like that. So instead, we're encouraging some really simple steps around how to spot phishing attacks, and what to do if somebody does click on a link, and what you can do to help raise awareness in your organization about the risks of clicking in links and downloading attachments that might be malicious. So this is all well and good, but unfortunately a lot of people will still fall victim to a cyber attack or a fraud carried out online. And it's really important in those cases to know what to do if you do fall victim. So for charities specifically, there is actually a series of things that you'll need to do, some unique to charities, some universal for everyone. And I would do them in this order. So the first of which is, if you think you suffered a cyber attack, or you think that one is perhaps even still ongoing right now, is to contact Action Fraud. That can either be done through their website, which is actionfraud.co.uk, or they have a 24/7 phone line, which is available, the number's available on their website. And that's the way that you report it to the police. That's the police's Central Fraud Reporting Centre. They're based here in the UK. And doing that will kick off a process which allows the police to understand whether they need to intervene. It also allows them to obviously begin a law enforcement investigation if that's relevant. And in a lot of cases, we found that actually reporting to the police might be a requirement of your insurance policy. So it's quite important that you do that as soon as you become aware, because they may be able to provide you with some advice and guidance on what to do next. For any charities that are in Scotland, it's important that you report straight through Police Scotland themselves. That's because policing in Scotland is devolved. So Action Fraud is for England and Wales. But if you aren't at all sure, you can always ring Action Fraud and they will take the report and pass it on to the relevant police force for you. The second one, as most of you will know, since the incoming of GDPR and the Data Protection Act of 2018, you have 72 hours if you think that a data breach, if the cyber attack is likely to include data, to notify the ICO. And the ICO won't expect to receive any comprehensive reports within that 72-hour period. But it's really important that they become involved at the outset of the discovery or the detection of an incident. They'll want to know things like the potential scope and cause of the breach, what mitigating actions you're planning to take, and how you're planning to address the problem. All of those things should be sort of, available to you immediately, but it's really important that you get in touch with them to save you getting in trouble down the line. The third one, which is unique to charities, is the reporting a serious incident with the Charity Commission. So they have the RSI system for a number of things, of which fraud and cybercrime is one of them. And they would expect you to report is if a serious incident results in or risks significant loss of your charity's money or assets, damage to your charity's property, harm to your charity's work, beneficiaries, or reputation. And if it falls into one of those three things, it is really important that you report, because obviously they're the regulator of the sector. And you can do that through their website. And at the moment, it's an email system, but I understand they're currently in the process of updating that so that you do it all through the website. And again, unique to charities is some obviously have other regulators or perhaps funders, whether that's a CCG or a local authority, or perhaps a grant-making body of some kind. You may be required with your contract with them to also report anything like a cyber attack or an online fraud to them as well. So it's really important that you kind of keep them up to date as this goes through. That's the end of the slideshow for now, but I think as we've been going, there's been some questions coming in, so I'm going to bring Jonathan back in at this point.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cub. That's a really interesting presentation, and we're getting lots of questions coming online as well, so I think it's stimulated lots of queries from people. So I think a good first question is, if charities could only do one thing to protect themselves against cyber security, what would it be?
So I'm afraid at this point, I'm going to have to give a slightly politician's answer. The main reason, unfortunately, if there were one thing that we could all do to protect ourselves better, I'd be very happy. But I'll give you two. The first of which is doing your updates. So updates are so important. They're free to do on all operating systems. It's the manufacturer that sends them through to you. All you've got to do is just set aside 5 minutes to click download, install it. You might just have to restart your laptop or your phone for it to install properly. But those carry really critical security updates. And the second one is using strong passwords, and ideally ones that are different across your important accounts. So for example, it would be really important to keep your email, your banking, and probably your social media as different passwords. The reason being, if somebody gets into one of those three things, they're pretty critical to you functioning either as an organisation or as an individual. So to keep them out of all three is really important. Obviously, it's ideal to have different passwords across all of your devices, but those three are probably the key ones to keep independent.
Okay, so following up on the subject of passwords, which I think is an incredibly important one, we've got a question here. Is the guidance around passphrases, what is the guidance around passphrases and non-expiring passwords?
So the guidance around expiring passwords has actually changed quite recently. So we used to say, and the guidance, particularly coming out from government, was to change your passwords every, I think it was 3 months. A lot of organisations do it every month, some do it every 6 months. What we're actually saying now is don't force users to change their passwords unless you think that somebody else has got hold of it. So don't have a sort of automatic change of passwords every 3 to 6 months or anything like that. And the reason being is because humans will rightly try and find the easiest way to do something. And what we found is a lot of people will end up with a password like, their children's name followed by a 1, and then next time they need to do it, it's followed by a 2, a 3, a 4, and so on. Or a lot of people just use the seasons and the year. And unfortunately, that means that probably you could walk in and the majority of people are using very similar passwords. And if we know that, and people know that because they've done it themselves, you can kind of bet your hat that the criminals have also learned that as well. In terms of passphrases, we're using the 3 random words because we found in testing with users that actually it's an easy thing to remember, that you've just got to look around your office or your home when you're setting a password and just pick 3 random things. So an example that we did as we were sitting down the other day is coffee, tiny fish. And it's not a word that's going to appear in anyone's dictionary, but actually, you're going to remember it because A, it's easy to type. It's not including letters and numbers, which just slow you down on the keyboard. but actually is nice and long, so it's not going to be easy for the criminals to guess either.
And just sticking on the subject of passwords, how much do you recommend things like Apple, where they'll, obviously not Apple as a product, but the approach where they will recommend what they think is a secure password, which is made up of, an odd collection of characters and numbers, and then to store that automatically on the phone, and then obviously access that using a fingerprint or a face recognition?
Yes, so we are very supportive now of password managers. So where your phone or your laptop, in some web browsers now, it'll offer to save your password when you enter a new one into a website or a website that you haven't visited in a while. We're really supportive of those because they're taking the onus off the user to try and remember a lot of passwords, and actually, because they're having to remember them all, they're probably creating weaker ones. Being able to, remove that from needing to remember it actually allows people to create much stronger passwords. And quite often the ones suggested by Apple are much easier. They're typically quite hard to type in. So I'd only suggest that if you're always going to use your device to sort of automatically log into the website or the app or the program. But it's definitely worth using a password manager. And I know there's some available on the Tech Trust website for organisations to use through the TT Exchange. And we'll be launching something we've called the Password Manager's Buyer's Guide in the next couple of months, which allows people to understand what it is they're looking for in a password manager and how to sort of choose one that best fits with their needs as well.
Okay, moving along from passwords now to another area. How would a charity actually know if a data breach has occurred?
It is unfortunately very difficult, and a lot of the research that has been done on cybersecurity, one of which, if people want to have a read, is the Cyber Breaches Survey by it was carried out by the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, who most people know from their role with the Office for Civil Society. But it found the smaller charities were having a lot less cyber attacks, or reporting a lot less cyber attacks as part of the research. And that probably is unlikely that they're having less cyber attacks, but it's an awareness of, a lot less are aware that they have had one. It depends on how it goes, but it's very hard to sort of pin down exactly how someone would spot it. One of the things we would say is, rather than investing, particularly for smaller organisations, in some expensive sort of monitoring software that would look out for cyber attacks, is to have a look at the Small Charity Guide, follow the guidance in there, because that will help you defend against a lot of the really common cyber attacks. And it's quite reasonable to think that if you've got those defences in place, the majority of attacks won't be able to get through. Things like ransomware attacks or extortion are going to be fairly obvious, because you can almost guarantee the criminals are going to be in touch to ask for their ransom. But often, if there's ever anything that just doesn't look right, perhaps in the example I used earlier of criminals trying to trick someone with financial authority into paying an invoice, the really simple guidance around that is, if it sounds too good to be true, or someone is trying to put pressure on you to do something that you wouldn't normally do, stop and check. I don't think anyone's ever going to be angry that an invoice was paid 5 minutes too late, because it definitely was the right person. But obviously there's going to be a lot more repercussions for the organisation if somebody, just thought they were doing the right thing and really rushed through that invoice. And unfortunately it went into the hands of the criminals instead of the known supplier.
Okay, got a question which relates more to the area of, I guess, leadership with this issue. Who would you say is actually responsible for ensuring that a charity has an adequate level of protection?
So traditionally, cybersecurity has sort of fallen into, that's an IT problem, we'll just leave it to the IT people and they'll get it sorted. We don't need to worry about that at a senior level or even a trustee level. That, has been true, and it is worked to a certain extent. But in smaller charities, there isn't necessarily the IT team, even in some cases, someone specifically responsible for IT, which means in smaller organisations, it really needs to fall to everybody to take responsibility. And for the senior people, whether that's, the managers or the trustees, to really show leadership about sort of taking forward cybersecurity in the organisation and demonstrating those really good behaviours when it comes to passwords. In a larger organisation where you do have that dedicated resource to cybersecurity or IT, yes, it's important that they do, the legwork in terms of introducing new systems and making sure that technically that the organisation is protected. But it's really important that the leadership teams and the trustees in those larger charities understand the risk that the organisation is facing the same way they would when it comes to financial risk and health and safety and all of those other regulatory concerns, and asking sensible questions of the IT team to make sure that they're really being held to account and are doing all they can to protect the organisation. And we'll be releasing some guidance for boards later on this year to that effect as well.
Okay, that's really interesting, because it actually leads straight into one of the other questions we've got. So one of the attendees on the call says they're over the age of 70. Many trustees of their age have little appetite to use IT, but are recognising they need to learn. So what are the low-cost options are there for trustees to develop new skills and get support when they're terrified by the complexity?
So it is a really tricky subject, and particularly where perhaps technology is moving faster than people can keep up in some cases. The first step, I would say, is have a read of the Cybersecurity Small Charity Guide. That's a really simple thing, which we've tried to write as in layman's terms as is possible. I'd also encourage as individuals them to visit the Cyber Aware website. That's designed for the person, normal members of the public to understand what they need to do to protect themselves. And there's also some really good kind of, free training courses and webinars out there about, digital skills. And a lot of those will encourage you to do nice sort of secure cybersecurity behaviours as well.
So there was a question about the availability of the cybersecurity small charity guide, and just to make it clear to everybody listening in, we'll actually put a link to that on our website along with the recording when we make that available. So that should be freely available for everyone. A question that again links into trustees, although it can apply more broadly to other employees as well. And that's that people are often maybe working from home and having charity data therefore on their home computers. What's the best way for them to actually set about ensuring that data, often sensitive data, is properly protected on their home computers?
So there's a couple of really simple things, and obviously we find in smaller charities and particularly with trustees as well and volunteers, there's no other option but to use your home device, because that's sensible, because it saves people carrying two devices around, but also quite cost effective. What we would say is there's a lot of cloud services out there, so things the likes of Dropbox, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft OneDrive, which have been set up to be able to access from anywhere in the world from any device, but come with sort of organizational level security. So they allow you to put two-factor authentication on, which means that nobody will be able to access the data particularly easily that you've saved on there. And then the one thing kind of attached to that we would always encourage is only email or do work business from a work email account, and only do personal business from your personal email account. That separation is quite important because it allows you to put your sort of work hat on when you're reviewing one inbox, and think about the types of things that people might send you and try and spot suspicious emails, and only use your personal one and kind of put your personal hat on when you're doing business on that account as well.
So you touched on cloud during that answer. We've got another question which says, can cloud storage act as both backup and protection from malware or ransomware? Could ransomware still encrypt your OneDrive, for example?
So a backup in itself isn't necessarily a protection from malware or ransomware, but it allows you to recover. And yes, so obviously OneDrive or other cloud storage providers do sort of provide that backup service. In terms of whether a ransomware could encrypt your OneDrive, even if it did, the advantage of cloud storage is you can go back a few days, or in some cases a few weeks, before that attack took place, and reinstall from that previous backup where it wasn't there. And that's quite important because yes, you might lose a couple of days between where you currently were when the attack happened and where you need to back up from. But that's a lot better than losing all of your data if you didn't have a backup in the first place. And it just gives that added layer of protection. So we definitely say that the cloud is a very good way to back up your data.
Got a question now on the area of device encryption. Saying, is there any guidance on device encryption? Is it something that has proven to be easy enough to implement so that users are happy with it and don't kind of notice it getting in the way of them doing the work? Or does it need more specialist support, and so maybe it's only suited to larger charities?
So there's a couple of answers here, and the first is around a bit of a myth about what encryption really is. Encryption can be really simple. So when you, for example, take out your phone or your laptop, that password that you put in when you log in every day is a level of encryption. It's normally a pretty good level of encryption on most modern devices. On a lot of laptops and computers as well, you can install something called encryption at rest, which is something we touch on in the small charity guide as well. Which means that even if somebody were to steal the device and take the hard drive out, all of the data on that itself is encrypted as well. And there's different levels of encryption that you can get. You might hear things like 256-bit encryption or 512-bit encryption. I wouldn't worry too much with how much you need to get higher numbers, particularly in a small organization. But just putting in place really simple things like making sure that every device has a password before you can access any data, and making sure, in some cases, I don't know if anybody's noticed this, when you just shut the screen on your laptop at the end of the day, next time you turn it on, it might not ask for a password. Now, if somebody stole your device or you left it on a train or something, before you've next turned it off, someone could just open the screen and be able to access all the data on it. So one really little thing that a lot of people can do and really useful in small organizations is whenever your laptop's going anywhere at the end of the day, is to make sure it's turned off properly, because that just makes sure that the encryption kicks in, and next time you start it, they'll need to make sure they enter the password or they won't be able to access anything.
So we've got a question about ransomware attacks. So if a charity, particularly a small charity, but I guess it applies to larger charities as well, suffers a ransomware attack, who should they actually contact to get help with unpicking that?
So the first person to contact is definitely Action Fraud. So that, as I mentioned earlier, is the Police National Reporting Centre. They then have some guidance that they can provide on ransomware attacks and what's realistically going to be possible. Unfortunately, they're not enormously easy to recover from. They are slightly time consuming. I would reinforce here, it's not a good idea to pay the ransom. Very, very rarely do we see anyone actually ever getting their data back, either because the criminals don't really know who they've infected with their ransomware, but also because you're then putting money into the hands of the criminals, and it's just sort of furthering their criminal ends, and they will go on to do it to other people. Should it happen to you and you've called Action Fraud, it is unfortunately going to take someone with a bit of technical knowledge to be able to get you back up and running. So if you have your IT outsourced with a provider, they should definitely be a phone call you should be making. Or perhaps it might be worth finding out who in your area, perhaps a local technology company, or someone you can just make sure you've got the phone numbers for, that would be able to come in and just begin to unpick that problem. But there is some guidance on our website on dealing with ransomware attacks, which anybody can visit. It's not just applicable for charities, that one, that's for everyone.
Okay, I've got a straightforward question here. So I think lots of people appreciate the benefits of antivirus software, but would you also recommend malware products?
So it's a little bit of a marketing angle here as to the difference between antivirus and malware. So a virus is actually a type of malware. Malware kind of encompasses every sort of malicious software. So what I would say is make sure that the antivirus you're using, is from a reputable supplier. Have a look at the reviews that are available. I know Tech Trust have some well-known antivirus providers on the TT Exchange, so have a look at those as well. But most of them will be able to cover the vast majority of attacks that you're likely to receive as a small charity or in larger charities as well.
Okay, and we've still got a few minutes left, so I'm going to try and get through a few more questions before we're done. So we were talking earlier about passwords and logging in, and one of the questions that's stimulated is to say, is it actually safer to just remain logged into some programs and sites?
It can be. Unfortunately, sort of whether you stay logged in or not doesn't really affect the level of security too much. The one thing, as I kind of said earlier, when it comes to shutting down your device properly, is if somebody got hold of the device and you're still logged in, unfortunately, that means they're probably now logged into it as well. So there's an element there that actually, if you're logged in when somebody gets hold of your device, that's actually going to make you probably less secure. What I would say is, using 3 random words and a password manager is definitely the most secure way to kind of handle your login credentials. We definitely advocate that if a sort of remaining logged into everything always.
Okay, and we were talking about the cloud earlier, and it's triggered another question, actually. It's a little bit off-piste, so apologies if it's outside your area, but it says, using cloud services, is there not concern about exporting the data outside of the EEA?
This is a very good question. I'm probably does stray a little bit out of my remit, but what I'm going to do here is kind of direct to the Information Commissioner's office, because it'll depend on where outside of the EEA you're looking to export data. So some of you might have heard of Privacy Shield, which is the data sharing regime between the EU and America. That has a lot of safeguards in place for that. And there's similar sort of adequacy arrangements between ourselves, the EU, and various other countries. So it will depend on who you're using. And what I would suggest is, as part of your due diligence for any kind of cloud provider, is have a look at where that data is ending up. Ask them about the regulatory regimes that they're adhering to, and obviously where you're required to comply with other legislation, is make sure that what they're doing is GDPR compliant, and get them to justify why that is to you, because that will help you kind of with your due diligence.
And I'm just going to wrap 2 questions together in one, because they're both about Cyber Essentials. So is it worthwhile accrediting under Cyber Essentials scheme, and does it still require mandatory password changes?
So I'll answer the mandatory password changes first. It did used to require mandatory password changes, that's absolutely right. It's either, and I have to plead slight ignorance here for a second, it's either in the process of changing or has changed. What I suggest is people have a quick look at the Cyber Essentials website to double check that, or we can put it out in the notes afterwards with a properly correct answer. But it's definitely in the process of changing. And in terms of whether you seek Cyber Essentials certification, it very much is up to how you operate as an organisation. There is a cost to accrediting Cyber Essentials, but it really does help you demonstrate a good level of cybersecurity, that you've got sensible protections in place, and can often really demonstrate to both suppliers, if you're bidding for contracts, that you're taking the security of data and the protection of your organisation seriously. So there's some definite value in going after the Cyber Essentials scheme.
Thank you, Cub. We've covered all the questions that were raised from the presentation there. I thought we had some really great dialogue there, actually, to explore in a bit more depth the very important area of cybersecurity. So thank you very much for your time today. For all the people listening, if you enjoyed today's session, can I encourage you both to share its existence with your colleagues, either in your same organisations or in other charities as well. We will be publishing this information, putting it all live online within a week. And also, I'd really like to encourage people to join our other webinars as well. As I said at the intro, we're running these because we're a charity and we're really keen on increasing the knowledge about how digital technology can, in this case, be used safely, but also be used to create more positive impact for charities. So we want to spread the word, and that's why we're running these sessions. The next up session is on creating a social media calendar with Lightful. So there's a link on this last slide where you can register for that. There's also a link by which you can also register just to receive notifications of upcoming webinars as well. So I'd encourage you to join in that as well. So I'm conscious we're just about out of time now. So I'd like to say thank you very much to all of you listening for joining us, and thank you again to Carl, and goodbye.